Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. An overview of Ibn Taymiyya's concept of FITRAH. The term FITRAH has its root in the primary sources of Islamic thought, Quran and Hadith, and it has been variously interpreted by many Islamic scholars. However, Ibn Taymiyya's conceptualization of the notion of FITRAH seems to be unique. This is because he did not only critique many of the previous interpretations before and during his time, but also provided some seemingly unprecedented theoretical extrapolations based on the various Quran verses and hadith on the notion of fitrah. Before discussing Ibn Taymiyyah's view on the fitrah, it is therefore necessary to identify some of the general understanding and interpretations that predated his conceptualization. To begin with, fitrah linguistically, as an Arabic word, has its root letters to be fatara, and it generally means to cleave open or to originate, to cause something to open up, or to cause something to exist for the first time. Ibn Manzoor, Volume 5, page 55 to 57. And it is in these two senses that the term seems to be more predominantly used in the Quran and Hadith. In its various derivatives, the term occurs more than 15 separate times in the Quran. And it is interesting to know the term appears only once as fitrah in spelling throughout the Quran. Quran chapter 30, verse 30. However, as a technical term in Islamic thought, it has been taken to connote certain understanding regarding the primordial nature of man. This is based on exegetical analysis of certain Quranic verses and selected relevant hadiths. Quran chapter 30, verse 30, and Quran chapter 7, verse 172 to 173 are some of the Quran textual references that have been essentially resorted to by many Islamic scholars to discuss the primordial nature of man. In addition to these verses, various prophetic traditions are referenced to substantiate the notion. For instance, Abu Huraira reported Allah's Messenger, may peace be upon him, to have said, "An infant is born according to his true nature. It is his parents who make him a Jew, a Christian, just as a she camel gives birth to its young ones. Do you find any deficiency in their limbs? You cut their ears after birth?" Sahih Bukhari, Book 65, Hadith 297. See also Sahih Muslim, Book 46, Hadith 40. Relying on these sources, certain scholars before Ibn Taymiyyah provided the following understandings of the fitrah. Fitrah as Islam. Al-Tabri died 923 AD. Fitrah as Misak, now commonly translated as Adamic covenant. That is the discussion that was alluded to in the Quran between Allah and the progenies of Prophet Adam. Ahmad ibn Hanbal died 855 AD. And Fitrah as predestination by Qadri al-Jailani died 1166 AD. Fitrah as human neutral ability or lack of any innate inclination. Ibn Abdul Barr dated died 1071. And Fitrah as inner guidance and conviction by Al Ghazali died 1111 AD. Due to the limited space and without necessarily going into details of each of these views, the following is a summary of Ibn Taymiyyah's critiques of these earlier interpretations. Besides the fact that he intellectually discounts the interpretations of fitrah as predestination and human neutral ability, Ibn Taymiyyah builds on some of the viewpoints by the scholars before him. He critiqued, reformulated, and improved upon their interpretation and articulated his distinctive view of the fitrah. However, unlike many of the earlier interpretations, he provides an extensive theoretical construct of fitrah in a way that was rarely attempted before. Without denying that fitrah could be understood to mean Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah avers that there are basic clarifications that need to be made in this regard. In his view, fitrah is termed to mean Islam only in a general sense, not in the actual practical understanding. Islam is more than fitrah, and the two cannot be equated as the same. For him, Islam is a comprehensive and detailed, revealed principles and understanding of creedal issues, rituals, ethics, and fundamental and jurisprudential principles on all aspects of human existence. While fitrah could be best understood to mean natural predisposition to Islam, that is, Islam in its human potentiality. Fitrah is therefore essentially a psycho spiritual and epistemic faculty that is ontologically part of man's nature, and it is functionally compatible with Islam. As a result, it is part of but not equivalent to Islam. In other words, fitrah is essentially an Islamic predisposition that is innate to man, but it is not Islam in the complete and practical sense of the word Islam. This seems to capture or reflects the statement of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, that every child is born upon the fitrah, Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. And according to Ibn Taymiyyah, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam would not have meant that everyone is a practicing Muslim at birth, but rather that everyone has a latent inclination toward Islam and its values. It is a natural, metaphysical constitution of man that is in congruence with the basic ideals of Islam. Fitrah, as a latent nature of man, which develops and comes to the fore over time, seems to indicate that Allah originally ingrained in our nature the cognitive and psychological tendencies that internally make us inclinable towards Islamic tenets. As an insight, this could be implicitly understood to imply what is now known in modern psychological sciences as intuition and human instinct. However, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, this instinct or intuition as human predisposition, that is fitrah, could not be taken to denote Islam. This is one of the critiques and distinct views of Ibn Taymiyyah on the concept of the fitrah, particularly when interpreted as Islam. On the interpretation of fitrah as misak, that is Adamic covenant, Ibn Taymiyyah is of the view that the Adamic covenant is not fitrah, but only presupposes it. For him, it obviously indicates with a strong basis the reality of fitrah as an innate awareness that is ontological. That is, the fact that all the children of Adam could affirmatively respond to Allah's rhetorical question on his lordship clearly implies that human beings are primordially imbued with a piece of innate knowledge. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, it is that innate ability to affirm, not the conversation nor the agreement, that constitutes fitrah, because it points to a natural understanding that is not based on any inference and learning or experience. Taking the above as a point of departure and by drawing from and critically reinterpreting the Quran and Hadith, Ibn Taymiyyah develops fitrah as an epistemic concept that could be employed to understand and approach various issues in Islam. To clearly provide his major extrapolations about the fitrah, the following is an overview of the defining characteristics of his conceptualization: innateness of fitrah. Ibn Taymiyyah holds that fitrah is man's innate epistemic capacity to know certain realities as self evident without necessarily having the ability to articulate them. Referencing certain verses like Quran chapter 14 verse 10 and Hadith, Ibn Taymiyyah avers that fitrah points to the fact that man is instilled with a priori understanding that seems to entail necessary consciousness that may not be readily rendered into words. He sees fitrah as an awareness that lies beneath the subconscious mind with strong epistemic values and weight, that is, self convincing knowledge. For him, fitrah also entails the tendency to be more inclined towards Islamic values and general moral goodness. Expanding on some of the earlier interpretations, that, for example, fitrah as inner conviction, Ibn Taymiyyah sees the fitrah as the pure disposition of the heart to be willing to accept the truth. He sees it as a psychic situation where a child would find it difficult to choose other values apart from Islamic ideals when he or she is not influenced by external factors. This is because Islamic tenets, in Ibn Taymiyyah's view, are in tandem with every child's natural disposition. The susceptibility and vulnerability of fitrah. The fitrah is part and parcel of man's nature. However, it's a dynamic disposition. Fitrah for Ibn Taymiyyah is susceptible to being influenced and affected, as it is not a fixed or unresponsive component of man. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, this view is predicated on the explicit statement in the various ahadith on fitrah. Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, for example, categorically identified our parents, that is socio-psychological influence, and shaitan, the devil, as factors that could affect the fitrah. Interpreting these ahadiths, Ibn Taymiyyah postulates that fitrah is highly prone to be negatively affected by certain socio-psychological, environmental, and demonic factors. And this is succinctly captured in the last chapter of the Quran, where Allah exhorts us to seek protection from all the evils related to the jinn and man, with an emphasis on their psychical influences. Besides these factors, Ibn Taymiyyah also discusses the negative influences of forgetfulness, self delusion, and self ego on the purity and state of the fitrah. The impossibility of total alteration of fitrah. Despite its susceptibility to being negatively affected and influenced, fitrah cannot be essentially replaced. The Quran, in the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, seems to explicitly point out that the pure and real nature of the fitrah cannot be totally altered and eroded. He premised his viewpoint on an interpretation of a certain part of the verse on the fitrah, that is, La tabdila li khalqillah, Quran chapter 30, verse 30. He avers that, based on this verse, the nature upon which man is primordially created, that is fitrah, cannot be replaced. He strongly holds that the fitrah cannot be completely uprooted, though he admits that it could be severely corrupted when subjected to serious negative influences. This seems to explain why man enduringly retains some iotas of innate goodness even when he involves in many atrocities. he's still able to maintain a certain level of consciousness about Allah and displays some level of remorsefulness and self guilt due to conscience. And these are alluded to by certain verses of the Quran, like chapter 10, verse 22 to 23, and Quran chapter 27, verse 14. In these verses, Allah tells us how human beings would always resort sincerely to Allah for assistance in the face of adversity and turbulent situations that are obviously beyond their capacity, even when they have been incorrigible and ingrate. Fitra, revelation, and intellect. In an attempt to provide more detailed distinguishing characteristics on the nature of the fitra, Ibn Taymiyyah discusses some of the relationships that exist between it and what he seems to identify as the other two basic epistemic resources available to man, that is, revelation and intellect. And this is very important as many of the problems with sources of knowledge could be traced to the confusion about the nature and roles of these epistemic resources. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, Fitra furnishes man with the basic, though undetailed, general innate knowledge. It entails consciousness about certain metaphysical realities and related issues, such as the existence of God and general truth about the religion of Islam. Inbuilt moral inclination, moral senses, etc. In contrast, the revelation provides definite and explicit knowledge, which includes specified principles about many of the realities that are deemed to be intuitively acknowledged by man's fitra. For example, it provides certain details on the nature, names, and attributes of Allah, some information on the future happening on the day of resurrection, specified moral dictates and prescriptions, well spelled out guides on Islamic stipulations on rituals, etc. While the intellect basically cognizes, synthesizes, analyzes, expatiates, reinterprets, articulates, guides, and contextualizes the various knowledge provided by fitra and revelation. It puts in perspective the received knowledge and principles from other sources. Intellect discovers and explains, based on revelation, many of the phenomena that fitra could not independently articulate. Revelation is partly meant to affirm and clarify knowledge from the fitra, while fitra confirms and aligns with the revelation. While fitra is a source of non inferential knowledge, intellect serves as a source for inferentially acquired knowledge. For Ibn Taymiyyah, through fitra, man's reason could be made to be more inclined toward the ultimate truth and righteousness. This is because pure fitra acts in harmony with revelation and functions as a check and balance to the intellect. However, with corrupt fitra, the revelation utterly becomes non relevant while the intellect loses its guard. In summary, for Ibn Taymiyyah, each of these sources of knowledge has its distinct characteristics. However, they are functionally connected as they necessarily form the complete epistemic resource for man. They are to be integrated to produce a comprehensive knowledge of reality that is realistic rather than being taken to be conflictual. Without denying his theoretical drawings from some of the earlier interpretations, the foregoing postulations seem to show how Ibn Taymiyyah uniquely conceptualizes the term fitra as an epistemic element. It summarily indicates how he developed an entire epistemological paradigm in which the notion of fitra is being emphasized and integrated with other sources of knowledge, particularly from an Islamic standpoint. Certain implications of this intellectual ingenuity on fitra have been attempted by some previous studies with respect to some aspects of Islamic thought. Its moral epistemological implications for Islamic moral knowledge are considered in the next part of this paper. Moral epistemological implications of the concept of fitrah. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the notion of the fitrah has expansive implications for Islamic thought. Many of the available studies on the significance of the fitrah in Ibn Taymiyyah's thought focus on the theological implications. Very few studies considered some of its other implications. For instance, Unjum 2012 employs it as a political framework. Muhammad 1995 and 1996 discuss its psychological dimensions, and Muhammad al-Bishi 1417 points to its pedagogical relevance. Fewer attempts are made by some studies, for example, Al-Afifi 1988 and Vasalau 2016, to relate Ibn Taymiyyah's conceptualization of fitrah to the knowledge of morality, particularly as an epistemic resource for moral knowledge. Apart from its apparent theological significance, fitrah is a veritable concept to understand the sources, nature, and basis of morality. And this is even more obvious when it is integratively deployed with other epistemic resources and factors. For example, intellect, revelation, human experience, and socio-cultural realities. Fitrah, as an ontological disposition of man, Quran chapter 30, verse 30, has not only the innate ability to spur man's consciousness about the existence of Allah, but also serves as an internal epistemic resource for morality. It is one of the grounds of human morality. Through fitrah, man instinctively grasps the morality and immorality of certain actions. He intuitively understands basic moral values and concepts such as altruism, gratitude, truthfulness, honesty, deception, lying, maltreatment, injustice, lying, etc. He inherently has contempt for morally wrong actions and intuitively prefers what is morally right, such as fairness, truthfulness, equity, justice, etc. Moral mindset and ethical disposition, in Ibn Taymiyyah's view, are rooted in fitrah, which is part of the metaphysical foundation upon which man is primordially created. They constitute man's native ability, which is inborn. Certainly, these moral competencies and inclinations would be affected, positively or negatively, by socio cultural factors. Their primary existence is not due to these factors. Based on the various perspectives of Ibn Taymiyyah on some of the manifestations of fitrah as a moral epistemic capacity of man, the following could be highlighted as part of the significance of fitrah in the total reality of moral knowledge. Innate moral consciousness. This is an instinctive ability to innately perceive and discern basic moral values and concepts. It involves an inherent capacity to know and understand basic moral principles without being learned on based on any inference. It entails a moral acuity naturally possessed by man and has little to do with social and experiential learning as its foundation. Like the innate awareness of Allah's existence, basic moral perception and value judgment knowledge are seen to be part of human natural disposition. Through an innate moral understanding, everyone could spontaneously and intuitively understand and distinguish various moral concepts such as fairness, justice, equity, unfairness, honesty, dishonesty, and dubious and unjust dealings without necessarily having learned them. For Ibn Taymiyyah, man's fitrah imbued him with the basic moral insight necessary to confront moral reality, that is, situations of moral decision and evaluation. It is an inherent part of man's moral consciousness. This is one of the moral epistemic manifestations of fitrah that was little explored by many of the earlier mutakallimun and Muslim philosophers that preceded Ibn Taymiyyah. It is a moral compass that is native to man, and it is not a function of acculturation and socialization. Though these factors would play a key role in its development and effectiveness, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, everyone, irrespective of his or her intellectual ability, has a general moral knowledge, though intellect would play a certain impact since there is a nexus between the two. This does not imply that everyone would necessarily engage in good acts and abstain from bad ones naturally. It, however, means that apart from the fact that we are ingrained with the general and basic capacity to know and differentiate between right from wrong, we also possess a higher natural inclination to do good because it seems to be more compelling. And this is discussed next as another dimension of moral epistemic manifestation of fitrah in man, a natural moral predisposition. This is another integral moral epistemic manifestation of man's fitrah, and it implies man's natural tendencies to be good. It is an unconscious inclination to do good and a willingness to abstain from evil. In Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion, it is generally part of man's innateness to prefer virtuous acts and detest vicious ones. It is engrossing and more appealing. In the view of Ibn Taymiyyah, for everyone to naturally like a righteous and good person, as there seems to be no right thinking person that would prefer mean person and malicious acts. Human beings, by their fitrah, do not only desire but also take pleasure in good things, and moral goodness would not be an exception. It is amazing to know that evil perpetrators generally hate evil, as there is no one, for example, that would be expected to tolerate being deceived. In the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, preferring evil is a pointer to the corruption of the fitrah. And this could serve as an explanation for the reason evils are cowardly perpetrated in most cases. Even when apprehended, the perpetrators would mostly resort to denial or rationalization of the evil act, without contesting that some people behave to the contrary. The truth is that it is not normal. This reality of human natural propensity toward morally good acts is understood better through other important dimensions of the moral implication of fitrah, that is, conscience, shame, remorsefulness, etc. And these are considered next: moral metacognition and emotions. In different contexts, Ibn Taymiyyah discusses certain metacognitive abilities, that is, abilities to self focus on one's thought and emotions, as key moral epistemic manifestations of fitrah. For Ibn Taymiyyah, these emotions are part of the innate moral epistemic resources that are rooted in fitrah. With emphasis, he frequently points out the innateness of these emotions and their moral interconnection to man's fitrah. Man exhibits different metacognitive behavior and emotions as moral expression and reactions. And these are known as moral emotions in the psychology of morality or moral psychology. Practically and experientially, they indicate the moral epistemic significance of fitrah. This is because the innate expressions and reactions manifest through moral self evaluation and moral feeling and consciousness, which are parts of human fitrah. Some of the few examples are conscience, resoluteness, shame, empathy, disgust, gratitude, etc. As an illustration, conscience as a metacognitive attitude is innately exhibited through a remorseful feeling that disturbs anyone who refuses to live or behave in accordance with an acclaimed moral value or conviction. Gratitude is an appreciation related emotion that is naturally expressed toward a benefactor. Empathy is a deep feeling of concern that is spontaneously set off by the plight of others. Shame is a feeling of humiliation that is innately elicited unconsciously by an unacceptable moral behavior. These attitudes are sometimes expressed outside moral contexts, and sociocultural realities and differences could affect how they are expressed. However, the fact that they seem to be innately displayed or evoked in connection to moral realities, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, indicates their epistemic moral dimensions that are embedded in man's nature. They are naturally possessed by every normal individual. The foregoing is a brief consideration of Ibn Taymiyyah's ingenious conceptualization of fitrah as an epistemic moral element in some of its various dimensions. And many recent studies and modern philosophy have been preempted by Ibn Taymiyyah's postulations. Many of his views that man possesses basic innate moral character and an intuitive sense of morality that indicate man's natural goodness are being considered and popularized by these studies. One of these modern scholarly examples is J.J. Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. He discussed the natural goodness of man in some of his works, for example, Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Confession, Emily, etc. Without denying certain differences in their perspectives, Rousseau, like Ibn Taymiyyah, holds that man is innately good by his nature, though he, that is man, is also highly vulnerable to the corruptibility of socio-cultural reality that would negatively influence his moral innate goodness. Apart from Rousseau, there are others who focus on the intuitive and non-inferential dimension of human knowledge of morality. For example, Sidgwick in the Methods of Ethics, Moore, that died 1958 in Principia Ethica, and Ross in The Right and the Good, and Maxia, Morality and Human Nature, a new route to ethical theory, and Audi, The Good in the Right, a theory of intuition and intrinsic value, and Justice Oakley in Morality and Emotion, and Roser in Moral Emotions and Intuition. Besides philosophical and theoretical views, there are many empirical studies that are now establishing, just like Ibn Taymiyyah espoused, that basic moral consciousnesses are innate parts of man. Many of these studies show that children at a very tender age seem to express some moral behavior. For example, empathy, compassion, a faint sense of fairness. Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil by Paul Bloom, 2013, and Moral Judgment and Action in Preverbal Infants and Toddlers. Evidence for an Innate Moral Core by J. Kelly Hamlin, 2013, are just a few of the many examples. Despite his various discussions on the importance of fitrah to understand moral realities, Ibn Taymiyyah maintains that fitrah is not sufficient to capture the complexity involved in those realities. As a result, he integrates other moral resources, revelation, intellect, human experience, and socio-cultural factors to augment the moral epistemic roles of fitrah. A succinct discussion of these other resources as moral epistemic elements and the relationships, particularly with one another, are attempted below. This will also clearly point out an integrative dimension that is minimally identified in Ibn Taymiyyah's approaches or perspectives. Intellect and moral knowledge. Certain studies, like Carlin 2014, point to some differences between the two terms, intellect and reason, without denying these, but only to do away with the related academic arguments. These two terms will be interchangeably used. And this is also maintained by some other studies. See Tasman 1930. This is because reason involves the deployment of the intellect. It is like an operational manifestation of the intellect. Having said that, intellect is another innate and internal epistemic resource available to man. It is latent at birth but develops over time. It generally functions as an ability to understand, interpret, infer, evaluate. With all these, human beings can differentiate between many issues and thereby acquire and build more knowledge in order to expand their general understanding. It is these capacities that are deployed to analyze right, wrong, good, bad, and other value related issues and concepts as far as morality is concerned. Therefore, intellect plays significant roles in the understanding and articulation of moral knowledge as a guide and basis for moral perspective, moral values, and decisions. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, identifying moral implications of issues is part of the distinguishing nature of man's intellect. For him, a sound intellect has the rational ability to know beneficial and good acts, and equally apprehends evil and vices. Like the Mu'tazilites, Ibn Taymiyyah believes that man has the rational capacity to understand, identify, and articulate moral perspectives and issues. However, he differs from them in their claim on the sufficiency of human reasoning with respect to moral issues and sources of knowledge. Vasilov, 2016. While the FITRAH as an intuitive epistemic faculty provides unlearned, non inferential moral knowledge, intellect as a rational epistemic faculty provides inferred moral knowledge, and other moral epistemic values of the intellect entail, but are not limited to expatiation and interpretation of moral stipulations available in the revelation. The moral self evident truth provided by the intuition through the fitra, moral experiences from the sense data. Intellect can perform these functions because it has analytic, synthetic, ratio capacities to process all moral information received from other epistemic resources. The foregoing obviously indicates, in a very concise manner, an interconnection that exists not only between reason, intellect, and fitra, but also between revelation and human experience. More of these relations with respect to revelation are discussed next. Revelation and moral knowledge. Revelation, that is Quran and Hadith, in contrast to man's intellect and fitrah, represents an external moral resource. It contains moral injunctions and recommendations and moral perspectives which are not readily available through fitrah and intellect. Quran chapter 2 verse 38 and Quran chapter 20 verse 123. However, the revelation is to be complemented by other moral epistemic sources. Unlike the fitrah and intellect, revelation is explicit, relatively specific, and definitive. It is also free from alteration and other corrupting factors, especially the Holy Quran. Therefore, it provides man with readily accessible and objective principles and standards in all spheres of life. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, revelation basically reaffirms and perfects the fitrah based moral values. It is not conflictual with man's natural innate value and disposition. It commands what conforms to sound reason and that is pure to the heart. It does not arbitrarily proclaim moral values that are in friction with human general nature and existential reality. Its moral principles, stipulations, recommendations, and perspectives are meant to be rationally understood by human intellect and intuitively attested to by fitrah. Based on these, revelation complements the other epistemic resources of moral knowledge. In fact, there are various verses where Allah appeals to our intellect, nature, fitrah, and senses or experience. Quran chapter 8, verse 22, Quran 47, chapter verse 10, and Quran chapter 21, verse 78. In other words, despite the fact that revelation is the most authentic and definitive sources of moral knowledge, it is to be deployed with the human intellect based on human existential and experiential realities and others. This view contrasts with the Asharites that seem to strongly hold that revelation is the only source of moral knowledge. To explore other aspects of this reality, an examination of the moral epistemic roles of human experience is considered in the next section. Human experience and knowledge of morality. Experience is one of the veritable means through which possible benefits and harms related to moral issues and situations could be generated, corroborated, and confirmed. And these are based on the five senses that man possessed. Through lived experience and reality, certain moral knowledge, like other information, is practically acquired. And with the continuous interactions between intellect and experience, man can assess moral situations, make moral judgments, and take moral decisions. The experience thus provides learned and acquired moral knowledge that is easily verifiable because man can always recall past experiences with respect to harm or benefit in a similar or related moral situation. However, other elements are needed as each has its respective role. Intellect is required to process moral data and to protect against phobia and delusion. Revelation and other epistemic elements of morality are needed to guide the sense data, particularly in new circumstances. The functional interconnectedness of all the moral elements is obvious. In fact, experience like revelation, FITRAH, and socio-cultural practice provides the intellect with the necessary moral data to make correct and accurate rational moral decisions. As a final major point in this paper, the consideration of the moral epistemic role of socio-cultural elements as external resources for moral knowledge is attempted below. Socio-cultural element and moral knowledge. Sociocultural factors or elements entails an aggregate of an extended commonly lived reality of a defined set of people within a specific locality over a period. Human behaviors are obviously guided in certain respects by social norms and cultures. As a result, they constitute sources of moral knowledge. And without being oblivious of the sociocultural reality, Ibn Taymiyyah, based on certain conditions, granted that certain cultural factors and societal mores could serve as epistemic resources to determine and inform morality with respect to certain categories of issues. This is based on his perspective on social benefit, common interest, and the public good. He espoused that is allowed so long the cultural beliefs and values do not contradict any explicit or validly derived principles of Islamic views. This is also permitted on the basis that such acclaimed sociocultural mores obviously provide certain necessary benefits to or remove certain harms from. This is referred to as conventional morality in modern studies of morality. And by implication, this epistemic moral element, that is socio-cultural factor, is subject to the regulation of the other elements, which are also modulated by socio-cultural factors in certain ways. Therefore, a particular socio-cultural basis of a moral value would be necessarily revisited and reformulated in the face of new facts based on either a more correct view of revelation, rationality, or new experience. Conclusion. The foregoing provides an overview of Ibn Taymiyyah's extrapolations on the epistemic manifestation of the fitrah as an internal resource for moral knowledge. The paper, through an inductive qualitative method of textual analysis approach, articulated Ibn Taymiyyah's moral perspectives. It focuses on how he ingeniously deploys the concept of fitrah as a kernel of thought to formulate an epistemological paradigm that has moral implications. The study shows that his view revolves around a position that certain basic moral knowledge is primordially and innately part of man's natural disposition. It discusses several ways through which the concept could be employed to explain the nature, sources, and basis of moral knowledge. Beyond this, it is also shown that despite his extensive postulations around the epistemic nature of the fitrah as an internal moral resource, Ibn Taymiyyah strongly maintains that fitrah is to be deployed integratively with other moral epistemic resources, that is, revelation, reason, human experience, and socio-cultural realities. For him, this approach would provide a holistic perspective on the knowledge of morality and serve as an integrated moral epistemological paradigm in Islamic thought. With focus on fitrah, the paper therefore indicates that Ibn Taymiyyah's approach to moral knowledge is a paradigmatic shift in the history of Muslim moral thought. Based on the foregoing, it is suggested that a more integrated approach to moral epistemology be attempted to further explore how the five epistemic resources identified and discussed in this paper interplay to capture the knowledge of morality in Islamic ethics. Apart from this, Islamic moral psychology, based on Ibn Taymiyyah's view, is another aspect of his moral thought that could be explored.